Yeah, so as Rajul just mentioned, I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the key results from the new report that you've all found out there, and I thank you also for coming. The lead author of this report, Jerry Nelson, is currently in Cancun at the COP16 meetings of the UNFCCC, working on getting our messages out there as well. So I'm presenting on behalf of him, on behalf of a number of other authors that you can see here, and as Rajul mentioned, this work was done in cooperation with Project Foresight of the government of the UK. I think Sherman will tell you a bit more about that. Also, thanks to a number of our colleagues for their work on this area as well. So, as probably many of you, or all of you know, we're facing continued very serious food security challenges. We've seen the high volatility in prices and the number of crises, short-term crises in the last 5 years that have bid up the prices of food significantly, even after the fall of prices from the sharp spike in late 2007, 2008. And these challenges aren't going away. By 2050, we'll have almost 50% more people, likely around 9 billion people in 2050. Almost all that growth is in developing countries, and a large share of that growth is in urban areas in developing countries. So there will be great pressure on agriculture to provide for rapidly expanding urban populations as well. Income growth is also a very important driver that is, I think, sometimes overlooked. And now we're seeing very rapid growth in much of sub-Saharan Africa, recovering from many years of very slow growth. And with rapid growth in Africa, there's a very high propensity to consume food staples and other foods. And together with the urbanization process, there's also this shift forward in many other parts of the world, such as Asia and Latin America, to more meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables. And of course, that changing diet and increase in meat consumption then drives a tremendous demand for maize, soybeans, and other feed for livestock. We're also seeing new and increased demands on the natural resource base, in particular land and water. With land is going to be increasingly involved in producing energy, whether the current generation of biofuels may not last beyond 10 to 15 years, but there are many other technologies that are coming on stream that are going to continue to put pressure on the land base. Climate mitigation, if it's done properly, will also have significant demands, and some of them could be complementary when you're intensifying crops through in ways that that increase carbon sequestration in soils, but others could compete with food, with you following land for pasture and other high carbon crops, high carbon sequestration crops. Then, in addition, of course, is the main purpose of this talk is the significant impact on climate change, which is a multiplier of these other threats or challenges. As our results shows, it ends up with some reduced productivity of existing crop varieties and cropping systems, putting pressure on long-term food security. Some of the new messages that we're finding here is that, first of all, you have to address poverty, and the poverty that is further exacerbated by climate change through broad-based income growth, and that income growth in the developing world needs to be very significantly also in the rural and agricultural sector, and driven by investment in agriculture productivity growth. So productivity growth itself is a key policy to adapt to the pressures of climate change, and more about that later. In addition to investment in new varieties, for example, drought-tolerant varieties of rice, wheat, and other crops that would adapt directly to climate change. There's a number of on-farm systems that can be put in place, including water harvesting, minimum tillage, integrated soil fertility management, that help to increase productivity, but while also maintaining long-term sustainability in terms of increased organic matter content and increased carbon sequestration. Rural infrastructure investment is key also to this productivity-driven income growth to improve farmer access to output markets, but also to fertilizer markets at lower prices, and to risk insurance and credits and other inputs. International trade agreements emerge again is increasingly important because of the need to to supply food to some of the developing countries that are particularly hard hit by climate change, so that relatively open trade is necessary to be sure that food is accessible under those circumstances. So the rest of the talk, I'll do a little bit more on future scenarios for climate change and food security, the impacts on supply, demand, and food prices, and assessing the food security challenge with and without climate change. We've done a number of scenarios for this report. I'll be reporting on only a few of them here, but the details are again in the report. And we're also looking, in addition to climate change, we're juxtaposing climate change against a number of underlying population and GDP growth scenarios. So we have an optimistic, a baseline, and pessimistic scenario on these, with the optimistic having high GDP growth, which I'll show in a moment, and utilizing the low population growth scenario of the UN, the baseline with medium GDP and medium population growth, and pessimistic with low GDP and high population growth. In terms of, to show the sort of range that we're looking at in population, GDP, and GDP per capita, you can see those yourself, that globally the baseline is nearly 3 times as large as the pessimistic in terms of GDP per capita. The optimistic is another 30% or higher than the baseline. This shows some of the range of growth rates assumed across Africa. As you can see, we do believe that GDP growth will stay substantially higher in the future than it was up until recent years, with optimistic rates almost as high as 5% in some of the African regions. Climate scenarios, we've basically done one modeling approach for each overall scenario, and here I'm presenting results from 2 GCMs. We did a couple of others in the report. The MIRAC GCM, this is the general circulation models that generate precipitation, temperature, solar radiation out to 2050, and the CSIRO, or Australian GCM. We're using here two so-called SRES scenarios, which are the scenarios from the 4th assessment of the IPCC. Those are the A1B scenario and the B1 scenario. A1B is a relatively high rate of climate change, but in fact is now considered not so much a high one, but is more of a moderate or medium scenario, possibly even a bit low compared to the trajectory we're on in the last several years. B1 is a slower climate change rate of climate change. We also compare that to a no climate change scenario, or alternatively you can call that a perfect mitigation scenario. What are some of the results? And what I'll do here is summarize the results in terms of income, in terms of prices, which are in a sense a good summary of the pressure on the systems in terms of supply and demand. And the first thing I think is to emphasize is that even without climate change, and these blue ones, the blue bars here show our projected price increase under the baseline scenario, so that's with the assumed rates of productivity growth and investment to the future, that we're expecting increases in real prices between now and 2050, even without climate change. But if you then add climate change to the equation, you see you get even significantly higher prices even than without climate change. So these show the real price increases between 2010 and 2050, with climate change added to the already significant increases in prices. So we are projecting under these baseline scenarios significant increases in prices. The climate change scenario effects vary somewhat according to the different scenarios as well. As you can see here, that this shows the average levels I showed before, but then shows the range around it. And as you can see that under some of the more severe climate scenarios, you can get as much as 30% more higher increases in maize prices and wheat prices, for example. So it's always important to look at a range of these alternative scenarios, because any one or two can be misleading. Another thing to note is that the economic growth and population does matter significantly, and you can see here again the 3 major crops under the baseline situation, the optimistic scenario, and the pessimistic scenario. As you can see in each case, under the optimistic scenario, even with much more rapid increases in GDP, the lower population growth also helps to reduce prices compared to the baseline. In the pessimistic scenario, you get very significantly higher prices for all of these. So in addition to climate change, of course, we have to take account for future growth and how that will change and modify the prices. See, the rice prices, for example, have very small increases on our optimistic scenario, because with rapid income growth, Asian demand actually falls with higher income on a per capita basis, so you can see significant additional transformations there. While maize prices tend to be, even under a pessimistic scenario, tend to stay high because of that ends up with high population growth in places like Africa, where there's a very high consumption of maize. So again, you have to dive into the different commodities as well. What is the effect of these changes in prices on calorie consumption and then on food security? Here we see the two projections. Sorry, we start from the base year of 2000. That's the blue bar, and the red bar then is the 2050 under the no climate change or the perfect mitigation scenario, where as you saw, there were some prices increases even there. But you do see increases in calorie consumption pretty much across the board, except in Latin America and Caribbean, where we see a transition out of some of the high meat scenario, high meat consumption in Latin America to more balanced diets. Every place else, you do see at least some significant increases in calorie consumption. But then you see, if you add the climate change effect on top of that, on top of the baseline effects, then you get a much lower increase in calorie consumption. In some cases, basically no growth at all. For example, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa on the right, the climate change basically washes out the growth in calorie consumption. That in turn results in negative impacts on childhood malnutrition. Here you see the same type of graph, and as you see there, we do see in all regions of the world except sub-Saharan Africa some significant reductions in childhood malnutrition between 2000 and 2050. I'd point out there are, though, these reductions. These are actually pretty poor reductions, in fact. So even without climate change, you're not making rapid progress to eliminate childhood malnutrition. Again, though, if adding the impact of climate change scenarios, that slows down the progress even more. And as you see the case of sub-Saharan Africa, again, even under a no climate change scenario, we're seeing small increases in child malnutrition, not improvement. And under climate change, again, a bigger impact, bigger increase in childhood malnutrition in sub-Saharan Africa, with an average increase of about 11% in the number of malnourished children across the climate change scenarios. Again, it's worth looking at the impact by scenario, which shows these are a bit complicated. I'll try to explain that. On the left, of course, you have the optimistic scenario and the growth path in calories per day under perfect mitigation or no climate change. That's the dotted line, and then for the GCM scenarios. So again, you can see that under the optimistic scenario, where you do have the rapid growth, it increases consumption and lower population growth as well. You do see much more significant improvements in calorie consumption overall than we saw under the baseline scenario. Pessimistic scenario, if we really do have another prolonged slowdown in economic growth combined with faster population growth, you see very negative scenario for developing countries, well, all developing countries, but also the lower income development scenario. So again, economic growth can be a major mitigating factor in the impact of climate change, but also, of course, can worsen it if we see a worsening of growth. A key final point, though, is that agricultural productivity is a very powerful source of adaptation to agriculture. We explored a number of different productivity scenarios in this report. One is an across-the-board increase of annual yield growth for commodities by 40%. For example, if the baseline has a growth rate of wheat in India of 1% a year, under this scenario it would be 1.4% per year. This doesn't seem like a lot, but of course it adds up a lot over time, and the power of that will be shown in a moment. We also did some targeted scenarios, including looking at what happens if there's a big expansion in growth in commercial maize. We also looked at wheat yield improvements, cassava, and then also in irrigation efficiency as targeted investments. What shows here is then how is the impact on child malnutrition, again in the change in the number of malnourished children in 2050 in millions. I think the point to note here, of course, is that while these individual targeted productivity growths go in the right direction, you can get, for example, the maize has this rapid commercial growth of maize ends up with about a 2% decline, a 2 million decline in the number of malnourished children in 2050. But it really takes the across-the-board long-term balanced growth, enhanced growth in productivity in agriculture to get big impacts, with low-income developing countries of about 7 million decline and middle income of about 13 million. So that this broad-based agricultural productivity growth, which also enhances income in the rural sector, has major impacts on reducing childhood malnutrition. So again, just to sum up, sustainable economic growth is a powerful form of climate change adaptation, particularly in the developing world when it's combined with broad-based agriculture productivity and growth through enhanced investment in research and enhanced improvement in on-farm technology and management. Open international trade, again, I think, and Sherman, I think, will talk much more about some of the trade implications of these kinds of scenarios. Is going to be essential for dealing with uncertainties and for ensuring the flow of food to countries negatively impacted by climate change. And just finally, that in addition to the adaptation investment is talking about, again, mitigation is critical. We have a little more of this in the report. That adaptation out to about 2050 is probably manageable, but results when we've done some exploratory work out to 2080 shows a very rapid increase in the negative impacts on agriculture beyond 2050 if climate change is not controlled now. Thank you.